Now, Soviet people tended to find another refuge from the pressures of daily life and pressures in the family. Again, just as religion went very, very deeply into the human spirit that we've been talking about, so the family relations, the ordinary, everyday human relations that happen in the most intimate parts of human life, became very, very strong, because anything outside those very intimate parts, you had to pay obeisance and homage to the official ideology. Publicly, you always had to say what was expected to be said, and of course, nobody took that entirely seriously. On the other hand, they had to take it serious enough to say it in order not to get into trouble with the regime. But what you thought on the inside, what you thought in relation to the people who really were intimate around you, was an entirely different story. And as you might imagine, the public necessity of a certain kind of hypocrisy and even lying in every human life made people pay a terrible psychological price for what they were doing. It was very, very difficult to maintain some kind of psychological equilibrium in the face of the necessity to say in public what you didn't truly deeply believe, and in private, of course, have people where you could say exactly what you felt. And partly due to the housing shortage, and partly as a reaction to outside pressures and angers, family life often became intensely close with all of the attendant characteristics. That is to say, feelings of attachment were very, very strong and very, very deep, as were negative feelings, including resentment and jealousy. All the aspects of family life took on a very, very special intensity. And of course, the inclination of human beings to find their sexuality in ways outside the marriage bond, to find their sexuality in various ways to somehow get out of the situation, became very strong. Zoshenko catches this in a series of stories, some of them not very far from the classical French bedroom farce, with a special Soviet and Russian flavor. One of them was called An Amusing Adventure. It starts by describing an affair between two people who were married to other people but who fell in love with each other, or at least one might say fell in lust with each other. A young woman from a petty bourgeois family who had fallen in love with an actor whom she saw and admired on the stage. He was a rather nervous type. Being a good actor, he was rather high-strung and nervous, so he was always very, very, very nervous when they met each other, and when they met in public, this was very difficult. When he went to her place, he became so nervous he couldn't do anything. So it became tremendously important, if their affair were to continue, for them to find a meeting place for their trysts. But obviously nothing was available given the housing shortage. So she got permission from her friend, a ballet dancer, to let them use her apartment. And of course he was very happy. He said, well, ballet dancer, that's a wonderful friend of yours. Of course I'll be happy to use the apartment. On the way to the apartment, he got on a trolley car. And while he was on the trolley car, he got into an argument, which, believe me, was not unusual in Soviet trolley cars, as I know from my own experience. He got into an argument on the trolley car. They're terribly crowded, and people shoved up one against the other. Tempers are very short in a situation like that. And he got into a particularly nasty argument with a man standing next to him and spit the man's face. Luckily, the man was leaving the vehicle, the trolley car, and the actor didn't have to face a fight, which he feared very much, being an actor and a nervous type. So the trolley car went on, and he got to the friend's apartment. The friend's name was Sonyechka. He got into the apartment. Sonyechka let him use their apartment, and they began to get into a conversation which turned in a very tender direction, and all of a sudden, it was interrupted by a knock at the door. The person knocking on the door got angry that he couldn't get in the apartment, and finally he began to talk, and the voice on the other side of the door turned out to be the husband of the very woman with whom the actor was making love. The husband wanted to get in the apartment, and when he kept on banging and they wouldn't open the door to him, finally he left a tender love note for the ballet dancer who resided in the apartment. And of course the woman who was having an affair with the actor suddenly realized that her own husband was having an affair with a ballet dancer whose apartment she was using. This begins to get a little bit complicated, but it's nothing compared to what happens in the rest of the story. This led to a scene between the woman and her returning ballet dancer friend Sonyechka, which was then again interrupted by the husband's return to see his paramour, that is, the ballet dancer. They insisted that the actor escape through another door and apartment, but when he entered that apartment which was next to it, he found the outer door locked from the outside. So he was trapped there in that apartment while his woman friend and her friend were trying to sort things out between themselves in the adjoining apartment. While he's trapped in there, he suddenly hears a knock on the door. Of course, he thinks it's nothing but a terrible dream and lies down hoping it'll go away. A man opens the door and comes in who it turns out was also arriving for a tryst. To his horror, the actor suddenly realizes that this man who's coming in is the same man whose face he spat into on the trolley car. As the man says, "Oh, fish face, there you are, now I'm going to take care of you." As he grabs the actor, manhandling him and hustling out the door, he sees the woman arriving for the tryst with this man into whose face he had spit, and what do you think? She is the wife of the actor. And from a timid, mouse-like fellow, the actor suddenly turns into an enraged, roaring lion. He says, "What are you doing, having an affair with my wife, for goodness sake?" And of course he says, "Well, now, wait a minute, we can settle this peacefully. After the affair is fair. You spit in my face, I'm having an affair with your wife." The whole thing, of course, is totally ridiculous. When the people in the adjoining room hear the noise, they come rushing in, and the scene turns into a marital conference. Well, now look. Now that we're all together, each one with his paramour, each one with the one he loves, who shall marry whom? Who shall stay with whom? And of course, each one has it figured out differently, so that each male character could be married to one of the females, and it doesn't seem to make really much difference to which one it shall be. Of course, the whole thing is totally confusing, but the point is, it's meant to be confusing. It really, given this kind of attractions, it really doesn't make any difference which person you're with. And as soon as they mention, "Well, you get married to her," he says, no, she has a small apartment. I wouldn't think of getting married to her. "Well, then you can marry the other one." "Well, I don't like the way she looks." In each case, when they suggest that one might marry the other and somehow work out the triangles, it turns out that they don't want to do it. The characters of the children might not be compatible. Who knows what the characters of the adults might be? Well, after a long confab and a long kind of argument, in the end, they all decide to go on exactly as they were at the beginning of the story, with some of the men seeing some of the women on the sly. In short, domestic life doesn't change very much, regardless how our passions press on us. And ideology about the reforms in socialist family life make very little difference in the way we live. Zoshenko seems to state very clearly, although he doesn't say it in so many words, that human nature and human pretensions don't change very much, regardless of historical and ideological changes. We set up many, many different pretensions and masks for ourselves, but each human being still responds to each other at the level of our most basic needs for love and self-respect, and also, of course, for gratification. This whole business of sex, of course, was something that was dealt with very, very widely in the Soviet society. Again, I myself remember at the University of Moscow stumbling into a lecture where the lecturer told the assembled students that he was going to talk about sexual relations between men and women. Well, of course, as soon as he announced the subject of that lecture, everybody was very enthusiastic and waiting to hear, and I thought, well, this might be interesting. I took a seat to listen to hear what he would say. He started his lecture by saying, "Well, now," he said, "under capitalism." And as soon as he said that, there was an enormous guffaw and laughter that went through the crowd, and I missed the whole rest of the paragraph that he was saying. Then he began the next paragraph by saying, "However, under socialism," and again, everybody in the hall, all the students in the hall laughed uproariously, and I couldn't catch that either. So I never to this day learned the distinction between sex under socialism and sex under capitalism, and I trust you'll agree with me that might be interesting knowledge. In short, it didn't make any sense at all the way they were dealing with it, and of course Zoshenko caught this in his stories very, very cleverly and very centrally. Throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, Zoshenko's reading public responded to him with enormous affection. His sketches were enormously popular, and the Soviet authorities seemed ready to accept him as a writer, well, as he would put it, who saw petty flaws in everyday life, and who urged small reforms to make Soviet existence better, all in the name of socialism. Then, of course, came World War II, which was known in the Soviet Union as the Great Patriotic War. Zoshenko wrote some stories involving self-parody, where he himself lacked the kind of knowledge and strength to participate in the mighty struggle. In a story called The Buoy, he's on a ship which is being bombarded by the Nazi Germans, such that everybody on the ship has to jump over the edge of the rail, so he jumps into the sea too, only suddenly to remember that he doesn't know how to swim. But luckily, it turns out that somebody had left all kinds of little bobbly things, little horny things, as he put it. The Russian title of the story is Ragulka, that is the horny thing, in the water. So he grabs onto one of these horny things and thinks, gee, how thoughtful this was of people to leave these things floating in the ocean. I can hold on to it and I don't have to swim. Pretty soon another man came along and he saw the man, so he too grabbed onto this horny thing. Eventually, a Soviet ship came close. And he called to the Soviet captain. He said, hey, come over here and rescue us. We're in the water here. The Soviet captain said, what are you doing, you idiots? You're holding on to a mine. I can't come near there. It'll destroy my ship. Well, as soon as they heard the word mine, the other fellow let go and swam over to the Soviet ship. And of course, automatically he let go too, but as soon as he let go, he started to drown. He couldn't swim, so he grabbed onto it and begged the captain to come over and save him. Well, the captain used some rather bad language to yell at him. Eventually, the captain threw him a line. He grabbed the line, and the captain was able to bring him to the ship and save him, and he realized what a backward person he was, not knowing how to swim in a great war like this. Of course, he's making fun of himself, but at the same time, he's indicating, how the bureaucracy worked, even with the captain on a ship who's trying to save somebody out of the water. Immediately after World War II, many Soviet people expected a somewhat more lenient regime. After all, they'd undergone enormous sacrifices with the loss of over 20 million people to defeat a ferocious and well-armed enemy. Their loyalty to the country could hardly be questioned in view of the eventual victory they gave to the Stalinist regime. And they expected that in turn, the Stalinist regime would ease up on some of the restrictions in life. However, the response was exactly the opposite. The response of the Stalinist regime was a strong crackdown on the population as a whole. The arrests and the forced labor camps continued at even a greater pace than they had been before. One of the most widely publicized events in this campaign for even greater strictness in public life was the castigation and humiliation of Zoshchenko in the company of one of the finest poets of the 20th century, a woman named Anna Akhmatova. They were accused by a functionary named Zhdanov, whose name became another word for repression in the USSR, that is, Zhdanovshchina, or Zhdanovism, of all kinds of crime, that he accused them of all kinds of crimes. He claimed that Zoshchenko saw the USSR as a zoo in which monkeys lived better than human beings. This was a gross distortion of a story called The Adventures of a Monkey, where the author had shown considerable compassion for an animal who had escaped from a zoo after a terrible German bombardment during the war. Zhdanov went on to call Anna Akhmatova a very famous phrase, unfortunately. He called her half nun, half whore. Certainly a new level of literary criticism in the world of literature. There were, of course, wide circles of intellectuals in the USSR and abroad who sympathized with Zoshchenko and Akhmatova, although they didn't dare express this in the days of Zhdanov and Stalin. Within the USSR, however, it was almost impossible to express this openly. Akhmatova had extraordinary inner strength and managed to survive heroically in every sense of the word. I know from personal experience, I was not there, of course, but I know people who were there, that when Akhmatova would walk into a room, people would automatically stand up in respect out of the strength she had to resist the kind of repression that was going on from the regime. She became a kind of uncrowned queen of Russian literature, of Russian letters, among the people that she knew. And by the way, not only among the people that she knew, but among wide circles in the Soviet Union. Zoshchenko did not have that kind of strength, and he was hurt very badly by his exclusion from published literature. He survived Stalin only by 5 years. He was unable to make his voice heard publicly. Later on, in the more open days of the 1960s, when the Soviet Union still existed, his stories were republished, and he stands today as a representative of those people who struggled, often by a powerful use of humor, against the repression of a tyrannical and powerful regime. The heroism of Zoshchenko, it seems to me, is all the more impressive in view of his own inner weakness, of which he himself was terribly and awfully aware. He knew that he was a weak man. He knew that he couldn't struggle heroically the way a character like Akhmatova could against the regime. But in his humor and in his parody, he showed a kind of courage and a kind of steadfastness that's very rare in this world and much to be admired.